Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sonia Osha, and I'm based at HUMA, which is at UCT. And on behalf of the Director of HUMA, Dr. Divine Fo, I welcome you all to another session of our African Epistemologies seminar series, Advanced Seminar Series. This particular seminar series is one of the wide range of seminar series that HUMA organizes and hosts. We have, for instance, the Attire Interdisciplinary Seminar Series. We have also the Doctoral Seminar Series. We have the book launches. We have the Ethical Humanitarian Seminar Series. We have also the Publishing in Africa Seminar Series. So these are some of the seminar series, or virtually all the seminar series we organize, and that's apart from our major research programs and projects we work upon in the Institute. And in this particular seminar series, which is the African Epistemologies Advanced Seminar Series, we profile the work of important African scholars and thinkers, particularly those who work with a philosophical bent and who've contributed immensely to the cause of African scholarship. This is a platform for showcasing their work and also the range of things they do. Today we have a very special guest in the person of Professor Edwin Etieyibo. Professor Etieyibo is a professor of philosophy at the University of Witwatersrand, and he's a very important figure in the field of African philosophy. He, apart from having published several important books, amongst them are Method and Substance and the Future of African Philosophy, which is regarded now as one of the most important anthologies in contemporary African philosophy. He's also the Secretary General, or General Secretary of the African Philosophy Society, which is the main body, continental body for African philosophers on the continent and in the diaspora, particularly in Europe, America, and elsewhere. And this body has been important in hosting important events, meetings, and conferences promoting the gospel of African philosophy. So we are very fortunate to have someone of this caliber grace this occasion. Professor Edwin Etieyibo, please welcome. We are very honored and delighted to have you on our program. Thank you. What we'd expect of you, you would speak for about 30 minutes because we also have a question and answer segment in which participants will be asked to make comments, ask questions, and so that you can interact with them. We like interactive sessions. So on this note, I welcome you once again, Professor Edwin Etieyibo. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Saya. I'm a very good friend and brother. We've known for quite a while now, and you have also been a very important figure in African philosophy. And I recall when we met in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in 2019, or the various conversations we had about how to move African philosophy forward. And I did indicate to you that some of your early works did influence some of my thinking. So it's very humbly for me to come to visit you at home, so to speak, in the Humana to give this talk, which is part of some work I've done in the past and some of my thinking going forward in the area of disabilities in Africa. And I also want to thank the Center for this way of trying to present African epistemologies, which I think is important in helping to move the discipline from where it is and forward into the future. So this talk is I'm presenting presented a version, a raw version of this talk. Early this year, I presented it at the Disability and African Indigenous Thought Workshop, which was organized by the Disability and Inclusion Africa Network and SOAS in London. I presented it on the 25th of February. There was a workshop for 2 days and I was invited as the keynote speaker. So I gave this as a keynote address. I've done a bit of tweaking since then, but by and large, the arguments still remain largely the same. So I have a draft of the paper which I'm going to read and speak to, and I will cut relevant sections, partly because I need to still within the 30 minutes that have been allocated. When I presented the paper the first time, I actually had 45 minutes, so a bit longer than today. So to begin, let me read you a few lines of the first stanza from the poem, The Little Black Boy. The Little Black Boy is a poem written by William Blake, which is part of a collection of his poems called Songs of Innocence and Experience, published in 1789. Those of you who probably are into literature or poetry will know that William Blake is one of the big figures in the Romantic period. There were about 6 very prominent figures in the Romantic age. The others are William Wordsworth, Samuel T. Coleridge, Pierce Shelley, John Keats, and Lord Byron. Blake is one of the biggest of the 6. And the Romantic period is known partly for trying to disrupt what you might call social norms and culture. Again, just a history of literature, the Romantic period is flanked by the Augustan age and the Victorian age. So it comes immediately after the Augustan age, and it precedes the Victorian age. But it's disruptive of norms and culture, of traditions, of what people think to be the standard of what should be said or done. So the context of that, one want to think about this poem. So the first stanza, which is 4 lines, reads us: My mother bore me in the southern wide, and I am black. But oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is English-eyed, but I am black as if bereaved of light. This poem by William Blake is a poem on discrimination. Particularly, it speaks to racial discrimination. A boy who is black and his reflection on his situation in the world. The poem points us to the world we live in with all forms of discrimination, from racial discrimination to cultural discrimination, to gender discrimination, to sexual discrimination, to religious discrimination, and to disability discrimination. So while this poem speaks to racial discrimination, I think it is appropriate to apply it also to disability discrimination, or disability in the field of discrimination in the field of disability. So we could play with the 4 lines, for example, and change reference to white and black to able and not able. So for example, the line that says, I am black, but oh, my soul is able, is white, can be changed to, I am not able, but my soul is able. And the next line that says, able is an angel, is the English side. We can then replace white with able and black with not able. This talk is on disability. So I'm not just going to talk about disability in terms of how one might think of it in an African cultural worldview, but I want to, towards the end of the talk, speak a bit to issues around discrimination of people with disabilities. and why one might think that the African cultural worldview in areas of disability do actually provide a platform for us to think of people with disabilities as not people who are inferior. And so the argument simply would be to say an African cultural worldview on disability provides us a better way of thinking of people with disabilities as not abnormal or not below the norm. Now, I'll pause a bit by talking a bit about how I got into disability studies. Those of you who probably have looked at my CV will see that in 2017, myself and Odiri Omiegbe did publish a book called Disabilities in Nigeria. Before then, of course, I've been doing a few work in disabilities. We published an article before then in the African Journal on Disabilities, which is on cultural practices and religion in areas of disabilities in Africa. So my interest in disabilities has come all the way from when I was doing a graduate studies in Canada, when I first of all taught a course in philosophy of biology. And then most of the topics we talked were around issues of disabilities, normalcy, abnormalcy, what is the norm of human being, what is the not norm of human beings. So my interest really peaked in those times. And I've been thinking about how one can integrate some of those ideas in my engagement with African studies and issues in African philosophy. And so this talk, as well as the book that was published in 2017 and the article previously before that, were all a combination of all of this sort of thinking. And so what I'm hoping to do in this talk is then to sort of build on what I've done previously, but also to make some arguments that connect to what I think should be thinking of, what one should be thinking of going into the future. I would skip, there are places where I talked about riders, so I will skip those. Probably if they come up during the question and answer, I would address those. I would also skip the next section. The next section actually presents some of the empirical work we did and some of the literature review we also did in terms of how various ethnic groups in different parts of Africa think of disability and causes of disability and the ground for disabilities. So I'll just refer to one quote, and then I will just briefly mention a few other things relating to authors that have talked about disabilities in Africa in different parts of Africa without quoting them verbatim. So Kwabena Akonsa makes this case that in West Africa, where they want to explain misfortunes or illnesses or diseases, he says that they do not do this in terms of Western scientific paradigms. Rather, groups in West Africa prefer what he calls spiritual causes of misfortune, diseases, illnesses, and all that. He knows that since in these societies, it is strongly believed that nothing happens without a cause, things such as illnesses or diseases and other misfortunes are attributable to some supernatural forces. According to him, sometimes the causes of some misfortunes are ascribable to witches, which are believed to be at work in the universe. What Akonsa says is similar to what other scholars have said in other parts of Africa, or even also in West Africa. So Harris and Sawyer, they talk about how the Mende society in Sierra Leone attribute illnesses or physical disabilities to spiritual entities. Sarapong also mentioned the same thing about people from East Africa. In addition to these scholars, Idowu also talks about how in places in Nigeria, the beliefs of causes of disability have to do with the spirits. The same is the case with the Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly among the Benin and Samba people, which according to Booth they attribute illnesses and disabilities to things that have to do with witchcraft, spiritual entities, gods, and all that. Lastly, Tim Kulu talks about the Zulus in South Africa and talks about how their ancestral spirits are postulated as extra-human forces, which have both personal and intimate connection with humans, and how they can cause all kinds of physical ailments, or all kinds of things that have to do with disability. This is just a sort of survey or overview of the way in which disability or illnesses or diseases are sort of captured in various parts of Africa. I want to say something briefly about two things that I think come up from this survey regarding the causes, the ground for illnesses, for disabilities. The first is that disability, so overall in general, there is this sense that some events involving the spirits, the spiritual world, which may implicate things like reincarnation, destiny, witchcraft, whatever, are in some sense responsible for disability in some form or shape. So the first point to take out of this is that disability has a material component. This is generally that what we see manifested. So when you see somebody who has disability, then you see the person physically as having some form of whatever the disability is. So that's the physical component, at least it's visible in that sense. Some may be more visible than some, but at least in a sense, I want to say that there's a material component to various forms of disabilities. And I want to call this form of disability physio-mental disability. The reason I'm calling it that is because I want to accommodate for both physical disability, like blindness or hearing impairment, and mental disability, like mental illness. So you have mental illness on the one hand, you have physical disability on the one hand. And I want to say, I want to capture them by using the term physio-mental disability. This way of describing disability, I want to say, is consistent with the social model of disability. So those of you who know a bit about the disability literature, we know there are two general approaches to disability, understanding disability. One is the social model, and the other is the medical model. The medical model dominated for a very long time, and it used to be the standard definition of disabilities. According to that model, disability simply is, it has to do with the features of a person's body. So it is some kind of abnormality that is present in somebody's body, and that is the way in which one would think of disabilities if one wants to understand it comprehensively. But the social model, which is more recent, in the last 20 years, has become a dominant and actually is the accepted and plausible understanding of definition of disability, takes disability not to be a complex phenomenon that's understood in terms of the interaction between the features of the person and the environment where they belong to. So it is not just the physical feature that is understood as what is the understanding of disability, but the way in which the person's physical features interact with the environment. So in other words, if the environment is not appropriately arranged in such a way that is able to allow somebody to flourish, that individual could have disability. So some environment somebody may have disability in an environment, but they may not have disability in a different environment. That's the whole point of this model. That seems odd, but it's true. So think about it, for example, a lot of us use eyeglasses or lenses or contact lenses to see today. Imagine about 200 years ago, when there were no science that helped us to be able to develop glasses, well, it will be the case that those who use glasses for vision will be considered having disability because they cannot really see properly and they would need some kind of assistance to be able to function in the environment. But because we have eyeglasses nobody sees it as disability because you just put on your glasses and you can function very well. So it is the invention of the eyeglasses, the environment, that has made it possible for us not to see being myopic or with short-sightedness, or not to be a disability. So the same thing with other forms of disabilities. If the environment is arranged in such a way that the individual is not able to function, then it's the case that the person has disability. That's the point of the social model of disabilities. The second point I want to make is the point that disability has a spiritual component. This is connected to the point about disability implicating the spirits and the spiritual world, and linked to events and practices such as reincarnation, destiny, witchcraft, etc. On this component of disability, the idea is that the origin of disability is impairment. It's not straightforwardly visible to us. I will be calling this component of disability metaphysical disability. By metaphysical disability, I mean spiritual disability, or disability in the spiritual or metaphysical place. Going forward then, I will call both the first form of disability, the physical mental disability, and the metaphysical disability, I will call both the holistic notion of disability. Now, one might raise two problems or worries from my view. The first problem is, from what I've just said about the holistic notion of disability, it's not clear what the nature of physical-mental disability is and what the nature of metaphysical disability is. The second worry is, it's also not clear how metaphysical disability is related or connected to physical-mental disability. Since both worries are related, I'm going to have a general response to this, and I'm hoping that the response I will have would address both worries. Now, I'll begin by saying that if we look at African hierarchy of being, so here I'm going into a bit of what some people might call ethnophilosophy bit. So the Belgian theologian Placide Tempels presented or wrote in the late 50s a book called Bantu Philosophy, talked about forces and beings and all that. Tempels' Bantu philosophy, or what one might call force thesis, simply means that force is being and being is force. Or simply, one's status is determined by the amount of force that one has. That is, the amount of force coming together determines the nature of a particular being. A lot has been said about Tempels' Bantu philosophy. Some criticisms have been raised about it being ethnophilosophy, not being accurate in some sense. I'm going to ignore all of that and simply say there is some idea that Temple did talk about that are shared generally across different cultural groups in Africa. The idea about spirit, the idea about the relationship between spirit and physical elements, the idea about these spirits having some kind of powers and forces. So there's a similarity in the way in which some of these ideas coalesces in what Temple means by the notion of force is being and being is force. Leo Aposte, the Belgian philosopher and logician, has discussed 7 ontological principles underlying Bantu philosophy. I'm going to skip all of that, but the primary thing that Leo Aposte was talking about is simply that in Bantu philosophy, forces are in hierarchy. Some forces are stronger than some other forces, and they can influence the other forces that are lower, and the forces that are higher can influence forces that are about the same level, and that they're all integrated to form what you might call a holistic notion of existence. All right. In a nutshell, one could simply think of forces like how some entities are held or thought of in the physical sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, where one thinks of atoms, particles, molecules, and matter, where atoms are the basic building blocks of all matter, and molecules are groups of 2 or more atoms held together by chemical bonds. So what makes one form of matter different from another form of matter is their atoms, particles, molecules, their number of quantities, and how they are packed together. In terms of being and forces, of force, where being is an entity, whether it be material or immaterial, force or forces can be taken like atoms, particles, molecules, and matter, in the sense that they, force or forces, are the building blocks of all beings and existence. And just like the physical sciences, what makes one force of being different from another force of being is their forces, their number of quantities, and how they are packed together. The point then is that disability in an African worldview is an umbrella term that describes how an entity or being influences one entity or another entity or being in the spiritual sphere, leading to a visible manifestation of such entity, or what we now see as disability, or the expression of such disability in the physical sphere. In a way, then, one might say that what occurs when the influence takes place in the spiritual realm or world gives way to or produces metaphysical disability, and the manifestation or expression of this gives way to what we see in terms of physical disability or physical-mental disability. Accordingly, it could be said that a being without disability and one with disability are simply entities or beings who are in possession of different degrees of forces of vitality that are packed into different forms. Just as a being in the spiritual sphere and one in the material sphere are beings with different degrees of forces of vitality packed into different forms. If I'm right about this, about the hierarchy of being, about the theories of beings and forces, and the holistic notion of disability, it's now relatively obvious how one might claim that metaphysical disability is related or connected to physical-mental disability. One straightforward way of speaking of the connection between metaphysical disability and physical-mental disability is in terms of my description of the influence in the spiritual realm leading to metaphysical disability and its manifestation in the physical realm as physical-mental disability. Let us call this sort of influence as implicating some sort of causal connection or relationship. One way to spell this relationship is to harken back to Leo Apostol's seventh ontological principle of Tempo's Bantu philosophy by appealing to beings influencing beings. This principle states, the seventh principle states, beings occupying a higher rank in the hierarchy can influence all beings of lower rank at any distance. Beings of higher rank can influence beings of lower rank or equal rank indirectly by using beings of lower rank. Beings of equal rank can weaken or strengthen directly and internally the force of another being of equal rank. So the idea simply is that the influence is in terms of the hierarchy of being, of forces and being. And this influence here, although understood loosely in the form of some causal connection or relationship, or linguistically, allows one to then think of metaphysical disability as explanans and its relationship to other disabilities in an African cultural worldview. That is, metaphysical disability and its connection to physical-mental disability can be understood roughly like the way in which explanans are related to explanandum. Namely, explanans are connected to explanandum in the sense in which explanans illuminates some phenomenon or states of affairs. In critical thinking and discussing logic, a piece of argument is different from an explanation. Regarding the latter, explanation, there are two components involved in going through with an explanation. First, there's an explanandum, which is a proposition or a sentence that designates or describes a phenomenon or state of affairs that is to be explained. Second, explanans, which refer to propositions or a sentence that are offered as explanations for the phenomenon or state of affairs. Simply put, an explanandum is that which needs to be explained, and an explanans are that which contains the explanation. The explanation provided by the explanans could be as a cause, antecedent, event, or necessary. So for example, we have an explanandum when one asks the following question: why is the floor wet? An explanans which one responds to as explaining the explanandum by saying because there was rain, or because of the burst pipes, or because so-and-so person poured water on the floor. What this means then is that my view that metaphysical disability may be understood as explanans and as connected to physical-mental disability can be said to be one whereby metaphysical disability is responsible for physical-mental disability insofar as the latter is a manifestation or expression of the former. On this understanding of influence or connection between metaphysical disability and physical-mental disability, the causal connection or relationship is one where the disabilities that we see in the material world, call it physical-mental disability, has its origin in the non-material or spiritual world, what I'm calling metaphysical disability. Consequently, one may speak of physical-mental disability as a form of metaphysical disability, or that physical-mental disability is related to metaphysical disability insofar as events or some things or individuals, God, spirits, witches, etc., in the spiritual world are responsible or do cause material disabilities or individuals in the physical world to have manifest some form of disabilities. Think of it this way. Suppose that one being, call it being A, has 200 forces of vitality, which are packed in a particular shape, call it Y shape, and is higher than another being, call that being B, which has 150 forces of vitality and packed in a different shape, call it X shape. And suppose that being A influences being B negatively, and that the influence diminishes B's forces of vitality from 150 forces of vitality to 100 forces of vitality, or changes its shape from X shape to Y shape. The influence and reduction of forces of vitality present B with different or additional features, hence the change of shape from X to Y. Maybe not different essence or nature. The different or additional features for being, given the negative influence, are what one may say present B with some impairment or disability. We might say that what we have here is metaphysical disability, which when it manifests in the physical realm is physiomental disability. So briefly summarize, metaphysical disability is spiritual disability, and physiomental disability is material disability. And I want to say something briefly about why might think that this view is a plausible view. Godwin Sogolo, in his article, The Concept of Cause in African Thought, talked about how illness and disease is discussed and understood in an African cultural and social milieu. Sogolo talks about primary and secondary causes. And in fact, he does say that for us to understand the phenomena of witchcraft and some of the activities of supernatural entities in an African cultural worldview or in African philosophy, we have to pay attention to the distinction between primary and secondary causes. I quote him briefly. Basically, the causes of illness in traditional African thought fall into two major categories, primary and secondary. Primary causes of illness are those predisposing factors not directly explicable in physical terms. Some of these take the form of supernatural entities such as deities, spirits, and witches. Others are stress-induced, either as a result of the victim's contravention of the communal morality or his or her strained relationship with other persons within the community. Secondary causes, on the other hand, involve direct causal connections similar to the cause-effect relationship of the germ theory in orthodox modern medicine. On this view of disability, what I'm simply saying is that we can say, well, there's primary and secondary causes that are lurking in the background, where we might say, if you want to explain just physical disability in African traditional thought, you have to also appeal to primary and secondary causes. Spiritual entities also be responsible for the way in which disability manifests itself in the physical realm. The plausibility of this view simply is that when one wants to treat illness or disease in traditional African thought, one does not just focus on secondary causes, one also focuses on primary causes. This is called holistic treatment or holistic understanding of illness and understanding of treatment of this illness. My understanding of disability here is one that is sensitive, sympathetic to this view about primary and secondary causes. And I want to conclude by saying two things. The first is that my presentation suggests that in African cultural worldview, when we talk of disabilities and use of concepts of language like able-bodied, non-able-bodied, ableism, non-ableism, ability and disability, we are simply referring to beings or entities that are in possession of different degrees or amount of forces. If this is right, then any expressions that suggest that the norm of human existence is ability, or that one that has disabilities outside the notion or norm of normalcy, or that they are not normal, or that they are below normal, or that they are abnormal, would be mistaken. It is mistaken because all that there is are humans, or humanity, or beings who are in possession of different degrees or amount of forces of vitality. The point simply is that if what it is that there is, metaphysically speaking or ontologically, are beings and forces, those with disabilities and those without disabilities are beings and forces. What differentiates a being that has disability and a being that doesn't have disability is just the amount of forces that they have. The same way that is what distinguishes a higher being and a lower being. That is also what distinguishes spiritual entities, God, in an African cultural worldview, because they have higher amount of forces compared to, say, humans, non-human animals, and inanimate objects. In putting it this way, therefore, I'm saying that the African cultural worldview does not have a place for discrimination against people with disabilities. Because what there simply is that there are different kinds of amounts of that the same beings, but different amount of forces that make up the beings, and everyone is being and force, meaning that we all that are as humans. If we're talking about humans, there is no difference between you, a human that has disability, and the other human that has no disability. All of us have forces packed into different shapes. If that is correct, then it tells us something that we need to think about more closely. I want to sort of highlight part of that by quoting the last stanza of the poem, The Little Black Boy. William Blake says here, "Thus did my mother say and kissed me, and thus I said to little English boy, when I from black and he from white clad free, and ran the tent of God like lambs with joy." Again, if you replace white with black, what we'll have simply is, there is, as William Blake suggests here, in the last stanza of the poem, The Little Black Boy, the first stanza tells us about discrimination, which the boy recognizes. But the last stanza tells us there's a unity of the boy with the little English boy, where they all embrace and sit under the tent of God as lambs in joy. There's a happy ending there, which means a world that begins with discrimination, racial discrimination, ends with a recognition of we are of the same humanity. And that is what Blake wants to present in that stanza of the poem. The other thing I want to point to is that if we think about this stanza of the poem, if what it is that we are one humanity, then all social and customary practices in Africa, and indeed in other parts of the world that discriminate against people with disabilities, are flawed and cannot be sustained. The encouragement then is that we ought to recognize one another as intrinsically bound together in one common faith. We all are forces and intrinsically linked together as forces. To accomplish this, we have to do away with the seed of divisions and customs that social practices may sow by further dividing humanity. This is part of what Ludwig Beethoven talked about in his famous Symphony 9, the last stanza of that symphony called Ode to Joy, which is one of best, people think is the, in terms of music, is the most fantastically greatest composed music of all time. Partly because it's the first time that you will have a symphony presented as if it's going to be an opera, to be sung in an opera, combines voices with instruments. In the 6 stanzas, line 39 to 44 of Ode to Joy, Beethoven talked about a time where all humanity will recognize themselves as one and come together. I can't sing very well, so I would have sung it, but I will just read that stanza. Beethoven says, "Joy, bright spark of divinity, daughter of Elysium, fired, inspired with dread, thy sanctuary, the magic power reunites, all the custom has divided, all men become brothers under the sway of the gentle wings, caressing one another as equals." For Beethoven, the magic power of the divine will reunite all the custom that has divided, where all men become brothers and all women become sisters. My hope is that our collective will, understanding, and desire will help us to dismantle all social and customary practices that discriminate against people with disabilities and that see differences among humans. Difference, we must say, does not equal inferiority. That people with disabilities are different from people without disabilities does not mean that they are inferior. They are just different. For understanding this, what we see is that we all are humans, a deep sense of sameness. It is that sameness that binds all of us together as one human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edwin, for that extremely rich and paranomic presentation. There were elements of African metaphysics, elements of anthropology, elements of ancient and modern African philosophy, elements of analytic philosophy, all within one pot. And your presentation, apart from being rich and broad, was also very interesting, very engaged, and very thought-provoking. I have a lot more to say, but I wouldn't begin with me. I would like to turn to our audience, our participants, and I would ask them to offer comments, remarks, and also questions, after which we'll return to you. Thank you once more for that very energetic and thought-provoking presentation. We are really grateful. Thank you so much. Audience.
Before we start, can I just say something about someone that is a participant in this Zoom talk?
Yes, go on, please.
Yeah. It's Professor Rob Wilson. Is currently in at the university in Australia. He is one of the person who has influenced me in terms of my interest in disability studies. He's done quite a lot of work in eugenics and in philosophy of disability. He did. I think he still do some of those work while he's still in Australia. He was my lecturer when I was at the University of Alberta, so he did teach me. And I think the course philosophy of biology that I taught, he taught it before me. So I used some of his materials and added materials to it. So I want to acknowledge that that he's present currently in this platform. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you so much, Professor Rob, for being here. We're very grateful you're here as well. Now the floor is open to our participants for comments, remarks, questions, so that we'll have a rich interactive session. Anyone with comments?
Tony has his hand up.
Okay, yes, please. Yeah, go on, Tony. Yes. Go on, Tony.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask the question. Thanks, Prof. Etieyibo. So just I want to combine three questions quickly, so you speak to them. So I'm just wondering why we need this account if we've got a simpler explanation for disabilities. Why do we need to appeal to forces? The notion of forces in temples and the others. Which is a more complicated explanation, appealing to metaphysical kinds and all kinds of things we cannot verify. I mean, even the idea of force itself has been questioned in many ways. I'm just wondering why we need this explanation that posits some kind of non-physical realm or entity. But I'm also wondering whether your explanation can account for natural disabilities. I mean, disabilities that the bearers are born with, because somewhere along the line, you explained that it had something to do with the interaction of forces and how one sort of force impacts another. How does that account for cases where people are born with certain kinds of forces? Disabilities. And then the last thing, do you really answer the question of which I think is part of the point you want to make, that there shouldn't be discrimination on the basis of this account? I don't see why, because on the one hand, differences in forces underline differences in abilities. So simply pointing to forces does not take away the point about differences in abilities. And so people could still discriminate on the basis of difference in forces. And the very fact that we are all constituted by forces does not rule out the fact that people with disabilities are different kinds of things. For instance, animals as well are constituted by forces on this metaphysics. Trees and every other thing, in fact, that exists is constituted by forces, just degrees of forces. So your account allows that there are degrees of forces. On the basis of what then can you say we can't discriminate between people with disabilities and those without, when the degree and quality of forces is different? Sorry, I don't know if you can speak to those three. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Tony.
Sorry, Edwin, can I want to see if we can take one or two more questions so that you take them as a range of questions. Divine indicated that you wanted to ask a question or make a comment. Divine. I think.
No, not at all. That was a mistake. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Go on then.
Okay. All right. So two things. Your first question. One simple answer would be to say I'm presenting a kind of more of a descriptive account. I'm saying this is how disabilities understood in African cultural worldview. So you might take it as elucidating the literature by giving us knowledge. And so I may not even worry about then saying, oh, okay, well, why then do we need it? Well, we need it because if we present it, then because an alternative explanation. So let's assume there's a simpler explanation. It does not stop us from then say, oh, well, the African cultural traditions do also believe in disabilities in this sense. So at least that is part of the motivation here. The second question about how do I account for natural disabilities? Now, of course, if the survey, I didn't read the entire survey because I said they have time. But if you look at the literature, you'll find that it's part of what Sogolo is trying to say, that anything that happens that is illness or disability in the African cultural worldview, the cause has to be both primary and secondary. So when someone is born with disability, the explanation would be where before the person is born, whatever happens in the spiritual realm was responsible for the person being born with disabilities. That would be the explanation. So the idea, Sogolo says, in African understanding, there's nothing that happens without a cause. You know, and the cause usually that is presented as primary causes or what you might call spiritual entities. Then your third question about whether can you remind me the third question, because I thought I had it, but
yeah. So the third question, I understood you to be saying that this account
I understand it now.
Some kind of discrimination.
Yes.
Yes.
So the point I'm trying to make is that there's no difference of kind. There's no kind. It's the difference in degree, not of kind. So
but I'm trying to see how you move from differences in degrees to no difference in kind.
I would. I would. I mean, even if you say there's different in kind, people might still say, well, you could make an argument that there should be no reason for discrimination, right? You know, but I'm saying that it is a more difficult argument to make if the difference is in degree than if it's a difference of kind. And so it is true, you're right, that even though the difference in degrees, there are different abilities. Yes, and I want to say that does not justify discrimination, because if that justifies discriminations, then humans should easily there will be discrimination even not in the realm of disabilities, but even in other realms where people don't have disabilities. So for example, you and I may not have disabilities, but we don't have the same ability. Some people have IQ of 150, some have IQ of 70, some are taller than some are more beautiful than some. Those are differences. But those differences are differences in degrees, they're not differences in kind. They don't make the person that has an IQ of 150 does not make the person a different human from the person that has an IQ of 70. They're still the same human. So they are still human of the same kind, but different degrees. So I'm saying that if there is a difference here, different forces they are all being, they are all forces, then it's almost saying that this being is taller than this being. That's what you're saying. And I'm simply saying that that generally we don't discriminate in the human realm when we deal with other humans. We don't say because you are shorter, therefore I should discriminate against you, because you have less IQ, I should discriminate against you. So that's part
But
of
we do exactly that, because discrimination is so irrational.
But I'm giving a moral argument. I'm saying it's wrong. There's no justification for that.
No, I hear you. I hear you.
Because the parent who does that, then
there was a piece of list that was
consistent.
On the group chat.
There's a noise. There's a feedback coming from. So there should so as a parent, for example, let's say the person discriminates against people on the outside. I mean, I'm sure they have children. Some of their children will be taller than some other children. So you expect them to discriminate against their children. So also is taller, but they won't do that. So they're not consistent. I'm just saying normatively, people generally don't want to do that, and we don't want them to even do that. If they do that, it's irrational. Like that's part of your point. And then the point you made about forces, if you don't like forces, use vitality, use energy. Same thing. So what African philosophy call forces of vitality is just, you might say it's just energy. You don't like the baggage that the metaphysics carries, then use.
Sorry to jump in, but my worry was really more about the simplicity in explanation rather than a more complicated one. Thanks for the response.
We have one more question. Minga, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for the presentation. I'm going to be a little bit brief. This can be a comment, or it can also be a question. I'm so happy that you touch on many issues, because you're touching on what I call African cosmology, which I think I can see where the challenge become when you start now explaining this. And I think your presentation has one thing that people should understand here. If one do not believe in what we call reincarnation, it's very difficult to understand even what your point, what you're trying to make there. Because in African cosmology, you speak about actually incompleteness. You speak about witchcraft, which I see it as an incompleteness. And you spoke about people not seeing that as a complex of inferiority and all that. But, and also you touch on, because the world we live in, it is the world of duality, where things are being presented in two forms, as you said, either tall, short, fat, or slim, disabled or able, and all that, which I really commend you on that. But I think my challenge here, not challenge, my point is just to I don't know if it can also be the essentialization of the African cosmology, I don't know. But as I say, it's not a question, it's just a comment that I'm trying to make here. But I'm quite happy with the way you've presented your paper, even the way you ended your paper with explaining. I think you didn't use the word incompleteness, you're using other word, which I think I understood it, whereby, it's a way of reaching out to other people, for those who have and for those who do not have. So that is just a comment that I need to make on this paper. But I think if there were enough time, I could actually engage with you on many issues that you pointed in a paper. But because we're running out of time, I think I'm not going to be selfish. I'll leave the space for other people to ask questions. Maybe we can carry on this discussion after this discussion.
If science, I don't know how they do it in Homer. I'm willing after 1 hour, if you hang around, if Homer allows us to hang around for say 20 minutes. After that,
me too. I do have a lot of questions, but I mean, Olerato wants to ask. A philosopher, human-based philosopher, is going to ask another question. This is getting to be a meeting or an exchange between philosophers and anthropologists mainly. Okay, yes, Olerato, please ask your question or make your comment. Thank
you, Sonia. Thank you. And thank you, Prof, for the interesting presentation. I'm quite interested in one of the examples that you made in your presentation about eyesight and glasses, because you said that well, I mean, it seems like 200 years ago, eyesight would be considered, or we're not wearing glasses at that time because glasses were not available, would be constituted as a disability. And now, because now kind of glasses are widely worn and kind of accessed, then that kind of notion of disability changes. And I'm very interested in how that really, how does it then feed back into how we understand disability as something that is almost defined outside of the person, outside of the being, right? Because it seems like disability in that example is more of an issue of access to the world, right? In that there are some people who have better access to the world than others, perhaps due to how they navigate the world might be a bit more easier than others, and that might be a fact that is not necessarily intrinsic issue of their own being, but it might just be on how how the world is available to them, so to speak. So I'm wondering how the issue of access and really thinking about disability as something that is defined outside of the person matches with your conception of disability as something that is associated with vitality and forces of being, because as we know, I mean, I think with that force-oriented mode of thinking, people tend to believe that that's still quite a very essentialized notion of disability. I mean, of being, and hence it essentializes disability as well. So I'm wondering how perhaps you draw how you complement the example that you made with the claims that you're making about disability being something that is somewhat part of the genus of one kind, so to speak, because that seems to entail essentialist position as well.
Yes, thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just come in? Did you take the essence of what he's, and I know his question is quite long. Did you take the essence of what he said?
Yeah.
Can we take one more question, please? Or you rather?
No, I'm fine. I understand what he said. So if you want to take one more question, that's fine.
Okay, Amani, please ask, make your contribution. Amani.
Yes, thank you. I am in the field of disability studies, and this is a very interesting conversation. We have been trying to put out the African voice into disability studies, and I think I have there's a lot of things that I'm taking home from this conversation. I wanted to comment the first point made by, I've forgotten the name, who asked, we have simpler definitions or explanations for disability. Why do we need a new or this thinking? And I feel like sometimes we say no knowledge is neutral. All knowledges are biased. Yes. So in fact, I wanted to ask, what is this simpler definition or explanation for disability? What is it? And how has it helped us? Yes. So I feel like this knowledge is equally valid to that so-called simpler explanation for disability. Maybe I go to my specific question. It's around, we have this robust understanding of disability from an African perspective, or what you call Bantu. But I still, there are cases where in Africa, disability was not discriminated against. It was kind of celebrated even. We have cases of disabled gods. You are a god, and you are disabled and you are thought of being a god. But we still had instances of discrimination we even have them now, like we talk about the killing of people with albinism and so forth. So I'm trying to see how can we explain that we have this robust understanding of disability, but still discrimination happens and used to happen back then. How do we talk about that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So just Lorato's question. So what I was trying to do was try to present what you call, I didn't probably do that enough, partly because I'm trying to rush through things because of time. The difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So the medical model of disability simply says that the disability is understood as a medical condition involving physical features of the individual. That dominated the literature for a very long time until it's now replaced by the social model of disability, which simply sees disability as involving a feature of the person's body in conjunction with the environment where he or she lives. You know, so what you call access is partly what I'm trying to expand to also include what the environment. So the environment broadly. So if the person is in an environment where they have provided for them, which is the access you're talking about, pair of glasses, then they won't be said to have disability, even if they have, if they are myopic. It is the lack of that, plus the physical features of their body that make up what I want to say constitutes disability. Now, so part of your question is how do I square that with the almost the essentialist kind of notion of disability in terms of spiritual and what I was trying to do in that sort of presentation was to make a case that in understanding the, so there are two parts to disability here would be the physical features of the body plus the environment. If the environment is different, there's no disability, even though the person may have certain features. That's why somebody may be said to have disability in an environment and could be said not to have disability in a different environment. If it is the case that in one environment, there's access to, say, eyeglasses, and there's another environment, there's no access to eyeglasses. Now, so when I say, what I was trying to present is to present the one part of those features, to say the body feature, the feature what we call that is generally made in the medical approach to disability. That what we need to understand in that context is to say it is not just physical. I'm saying this is a physical and spiritual elements in the African worldview. I'm trying to present that.
So
But my account allows for the possibility that even when
let them to put it down.
Even when the person is has those features, that allows for the possibility that in the physical world, the manifestation in the physical world may be one that will not cause disability if the environment is organized in such a way that responds appropriately to those physical features. So we might even say somebody that has certain features, both the spiritual and the physical, we might say, even though they satisfy one part of what would constitute disability, insofar as the environment also allows that, we might say this environment they don't have disabilities simply because the environment obviously is a different environment and does respond appropriately to those physical bodies. So it is not, the account is not sort of problematic on the social model. If I don't think it's even contrary to it, I think the social model, the social model allows it in the sense in which if what I was doing was just giving a descriptive account of what constitutes the features of the body. And I'm saying the features of the body are not just the physical, but there's also the spiritual element to that. That's what I'm trying to do in my account. And then the question by, what's his name? Is Sona, by the name. But the question, Minga, okay, Minga. The question is that, yeah, you're right. I didn't have the time to read all that, the survey of some of the work we did about how in some African area, cultural settings or ethnic groups, they celebrate people with disabilities. But of course, in many parts of Africa today, all kinds of discrimination against people, albinism, and others and all that. Now, what I'm trying to do, as I try to indicate towards the end of the paper, was to say, look, those people who engage in all kinds of discrimination, whether in Africa or outside, in fact, especially in Africa, they are actually either ignorant of the metaphysical underpinning of their cultural belief. But if they understand it properly, then they will not engage in these forms of discrimination. So if those who are engaged in disability studies like yourself and others who actually have their boots on the ground and do the work of advocacy and try to change beliefs or try to educate people, try to get them to have a proper sense of how to treat people with disabilities, one way to talk to them to say, look, hang on a minute, what you're doing is actually against your own cultural metaphysical belief. If you understand your cultural, the underpinnings of your cultural beliefs, the metaphysical underpinning, you will know that both those with disabilities and those without disabilities are the same kind, different degrees. And once you know that, you ought not to discriminate against these people. That's part of what I'm trying to do, is to sort of give that sort of overall argument that then will become something that one can present and say, hey, you are acting consistently to your belief should be this, not this. You should be behaving this way, not this way, given the metaphysical underpinning of your cultural views about disability.
Any more questions? Any more questions? I think I should add, I don't know whether it's a comment or a question to your presentation to react. Like I said, because it contains several elements, I was expecting perhaps the more physiological aspects of disabilities, what it entails now in a social context. I like the fact that you brought up the fact that we hold a lot of ambivalent feelings towards disabilities, and a lot of us also don't understand the metaphysical underpinnings of what disability entails. From a philosophical perspective, how do you approach that? If, for instance, you want to approach it from an analytical perspective, how do you approach that? If you want, like you alluded to aspects of African metaphysics, which is quite rich and I think quite useful as a way of explaining disabilities. But also, like, there were elements of analytic philosophy which tends to be, tends to at least shy away from difficult metaphysical questions. So and because you had all these elements in your presentation, I wanted like a clearer response to these conflicting conceptual tools and approaches, because they're a bit because African metaphysics and analytic philosophy is a bit difficult, and the physiological and the metaphysical and what have you. So yes, all these questions were up in the air, and I was thinking, how did you negotiate this difficult, problematic conceptual challenge?
Look, it's true, I'm trained in analytical philosophy and African philosophy, which I've been doing quite so many years. I'm trained analytical philosophy. I think sometimes this bifurcation makes things more difficult for us because we tend to treat them as separate areas, whereas they are actually, in a sense, very related more than we think. My thinking of analytic philosophy, analytic philosophy, there are many ways in which you want to think about, you can define analytic philosophy, but I think one way I think of it in terms of as a method. If you also want to think of philosophy as a method of inquiry, critical, rigorous, systematic, it's not about the subject matter or the content, but so much as as a tool, as a method of engagement, of searching for wisdom. I see analytic philosophy in that sort of way to say it's just a method, and the methodology is such that you try to come up with a conclusion, whatever that conclusion is, and you have series of steps or premises of what you might call. So you have an argument, and then you have a conclusion, and you have premises that tend to give you your conclusion. And so I see analytic philosophy as positing a belief, a proposition, or something about a claim, and then trying to show whether that claim is true or false, and how to understand that claim and all that, and construct an argument. Do that. I see that. So when I say I'm analytic philosophy, I am in that sort of methodology in the sense in which I do that. I'm not. There are other ways of thinking of analytic philosophy. I don't think of myself in those terms. So what I try to do here is to say, look, I have a conclusion I want to arrive at. I want to say, look, this is what I think of disabilities in an African worldview, and these are my arguments for support this claim, and do the premises hang together? Do they lead to the conclusion? If yes, if no, what's the problem with the argument and all that? So when I make reference to the logic and make reference to explanandum, explanans, and I'm trying to draw on a rich area in, you might say, analytic philosophy, which is about logic, about argumentation, about explanation, about the relationship between concepts and how you can understand the phenomenon in terms of some other concepts. So I think with that kind of tool, you can do any kind of philosophy. You can do Chinese philosophy, African philosophy. People can approach African philosophy from a continental point of view, where they are continental philosophers, for example, and don't have this kind of argumentation. But I don't really see that is a tension in terms of, insofar as I am strictly thinking of analytic philosophy in terms of methodology. And that's what I'm trying to employ here in my understanding and discussion of the disabilities in an African cultural worldview. I don't see where they are the conflicts. Maybe they are, but if they are, then I don't think they are. If they are, it's not because I'm employing the methodology of analytic philosophy. It may be that because maybe I missed something in my presentation of African philosophy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any more comments, reactions, questions? Right. Any more? If at this stage you don't have any more, which we've actually gone well over time, the director, was fortunate to add a few more minutes to your session. So we're very grateful actually for the extra time we had. We had a wonderful time with your presentation, the questions, the comments, both from yourself and the audience. And I'd like to thank you for such a rich and engaging, thought-provoking presentation, and also our audience. On that note, I like us to conclude this session, and to also remind you that we have other events coming up. We have one for Thursday. We have for the rest of the month and into next month. Please visit our events page. Visit our events page, and you'll see there's a calendar of events of the programs which we will be organizing throughout the course of the semester. On that note, I thank you again, Edwin. I thank our participants. And yes, until we see you again, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone for coming.